Greetings from Flat Creek Road here in Black Mountain, North Carolina. This is Professor Brandenburg speaking to the Global Crisis students. Today's lecture will look at China in the 20th century. In many ways, China had the most fascinating century of any nation. That includes the American century. This is a nation that moves from the world of dynasty to a republic, to civil war, to communist rule, to Maoist communist rule, to something like totalitarian capitalism or authoritarian capitalism today. So we have a lot going on here, and we're going to unpack China in the 20th century over the next 45 minutes or so. In this lecture, we'll have 5 moments. We'll look at the last dynasty and the fall of 4,000 years of dynastic rule in China. We'll look at Sun Yat-sen and the revolution of 1911 and the frail republic that followed. We'll then take a look at the civil war between the Republicans and the communists. I think you know that the communists do win this struggle. So we'll look at Mao's moves in the 1950s and 1960s. Then we'll take a break and look at the Christian martyr Lin Zhao, whose book Blood Letters we are reading in class this week. Finally, we'll close with a bit of an epilogue. We'll look at what's happened in China from the 1970s to today. We'll look at reform and the limits of reform. So to know something about China, we need to look at the larger context, right? China has had 4,000 years of dynastic rule, kind of like ancient Egypt. Traditionally, China organized its history through dynasties. Now, around the 1500s, with the emergence of Europe, Ming China is probably the most powerful single empire in the entire world, certainly the most wealthiest. But over the next 300-400 years, China decreases in power in relation to Europe. And in the 1800s, we have the Qing dynasty. And they're suffering a series of problems. For starters, rulers are not paying attention to what's happening in the Atlantic world. They're largely shut off from the rest of the world. Their population is booming. They're estimated at around 300 million people in the mid-1800s. And this is a population which the Qing dynasty taxed lightly. At this point, quite surprisingly for China, they're finding it difficult to administer the realm. This gives space for a whole bunch of local officials to grow corrupt, to run their own little mini fiefdoms. There's several rural rebellions against the dynasty. So by the late 1800s, China can't really ignore European powers. The chief European power in China is the British Empire. And in the British Empire, there was a large company called the East India Company, by some measures the most significant company in modern human history, certainly the most significant company in the 18th and 19th century. What they were doing was that they had already de facto taken over India, and they were fueling the consumption of opium, a very dangerous narcotic, from India to China in order to purchase Chinese tea, which had become a staple in British culture. So the use of opium was used to cut down on the need to pay Chinese goods with what they wanted was silver. So what happens is silver begins to flow out of China, reversing a long-term trend. In 1834, Parliament ends the company's trade monopoly with China, meaning more merchants could provide opium for Chinese addicts. In 1838, in Beijing, they attempt to end the opium trade. They try to ban opium, good policy, and the British say no. They send in a fleet and they begin to bombard coastal regions and sail up rivers. There's a battle, and the Chinese junks are absolutely defeated by the technologically superior British Navy. So the Qing dynasty sues for peace in 1841. They agree to cede the island of Hong Kong, seen in the slide here, to the British. They pay an indemnity for the war. They opened 5, quote-unquote, treaty ports to foreign trade and settlements. They agreed to extraterritoriality for European residents. So Europeans were not subject to Chinese laws. And this really weakens this last dynasty. One response of this is that there is a rebellion against Western influence called the Boxer Rebellion. Now, this is worthy of a lecture in all its own. Missionaries are captured by Chinese sectarian forces. In response, the government can't do much, and foreign troops, including the Marines, are brought in to free these missionaries in a much publicized international affair. So China is growing very, very weak. And this brings us to a fascinating individual named Sun Yat-sen, seen in the center of this slide. Sun Yat-sen is born in 1886. He attends the Hong Kong College for Medicine, so he becomes a physician. And he is a Christian. He attends Tsai Church, founded by the London Missionary Society in the late 1800s, and he pictured a revolution in China as similar to the salvation mission of the Christian church. In many ways, his conversion to Christianity was also related to his revolutionary ideals that he wanted to push through. So him and some other friends found the Kuomintang or the Kuomintang party, and they begin to plot for revolution. Now, as an aside, Sun Yat-sen would marry a woman named Qing Ling. And as you can see in this picture, there they are on the left, the lovely gentleman and his bride, I believe, third at the time. They actually came to Montreat in 1907. So Qing Ling and his sister Mei Ling, pictured on the right, she would marry Sun Yat-sen's successor, Chiang Kai-shek. So Montreat, Little Montreat has a very historic connection to the two of the most significant individuals of 20th century China. So Sun Yat-sen leads a revolution. And they are successful. In 1911, they overthrow the emperor, at this time very weak, and they are which is really quite shocking, 4,000 years of dynastic rule ends, and China becomes a republic. Their principles are threefold. Nationalism, right? All the rage across the world. Think Germany, think Italy. This is right before Woodrow Wilson will issue his famous 14 points calling for global self-determination. So he's a nationalist. He's into democracy. So he's a very modern person, very much influenced by Protestant missionaries and the Christian church in China as well. And this is also perhaps a social gospel-oriented revolution. In addition to nationalism and democracy, there's a third principle of the people's livelihood. So this is a republic that seeks to improve the lives of the poor. These are called the principles of the people. Unfortunately for Sun Yat-sen, The 19 teens and 20s and 30s proved to be quite divisive. While they are officially in charge, um, China is still quite weak in relation to foreign powers. Um, Russia to the north encourages, the expansion of communism. So uh, they've got communists running around in China, and as they're quite weak, you also have local strongmen, essentially rule de facto many kingdoms in China. If you watched uh, the Indiana Jones vehicle Temple of Doom from 1984, which incidentally was so dark that the PG-13 rating was invented by Hollywood. There's a scene early on in China, which it's actually a very racist depiction of Chinese culture and life. But you see this sort of decadence and localism that in Greater Shanghai that the Republic was perhaps unable to really combat. So what happens in China is that a civil war emerges between the Kuomintang and the CCP, or the Chinese Communist Party. Here we have an individual named Chiang Kai-shek. He's the chosen successor of Sun Yat-sen, and he's battling against a rising communist star named Mao Zedong. Now, we're not going to go in the backstory of Mao Zedong, but Mao Zedong is really a fascinating individual. In college he joins the Republicans, but in a college election he's not chosen to become president. He's only like the secretary. He's very upset about this, so he runs across campus and he joins the Communist Club, and he becomes the president of the Communist Club, and that's his path. So he becomes a leader of the Communist Party eventually, and in 1934 they're under heavy attack by the nationalist Republicans led by Chiang Kai-shek. So they famously embark on a 6,000-mile journey, the so-called Long March, to the northwest remote part of the country to escape further attacks. Many thousands died on this journey. Only several hundred survived this vicious struggle, but this is sort of the moment, key sort of identifying moment for the modern Communist Party in China. Every young Chinese schoolchild learns of the Long March. But what happens in the 1930s is that the Japanese invade as part of their mission of imperial expansion leading up to World War II. And in this space, Mao Zedong is very talented at reaching to the peasants. He has this vision of a peasant revolution that wins broad support in China and will eventually serve as a model for other third world revolutionaries after 1945. And for a brief moment, the communists and the Republicans, or the nationalists, they both team up to together fight the mighty Japanese imperial forces. And in this struggle, the communists are more successful. So they're viewed as better fighters. They gain important training of how to fight. So, um, despite the nationalists' close relationship with, see, for example, the United States, here's Chiang Kai-shek meeting with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The communists win the Civil War. As you can see on this map, they move from the northeast of China, slowly taking more and more territory, including Tibet, and the young Dalai Lama, who's still with us, escapes to the west. But what happens to Chiang Kai-shek and the Republicans? Well, they jump on board ships, and they cross to the island of Formosa, also known as Taiwan, where Chiang Kai-shek leads Taiwan into the post-war era. This is still an incredibly contentious issue, as the current Chinese regime views Taiwan as part of their one China policy. And indeed, this becomes a site of great Cold War tensions between the United States and China, including a 1954 incident where nuclear weaponry is almost used. Some historians have argued that this moment was actually more intense than the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. All right, so Mao's in charge. He establishes the People's Republic of China in Tiananmen Square in Beijing on October 1st, 1949. Now, most Chinese knew very little about the Communist Party, but many of them had very high hopes for a new, independent, and liberated China. This was a revolution, according to Mao, that would move three big mountains. It would remove imperialism, it would remove feudalism, and it would remove corrupt bureaucratic capitalism. So if you want to know why so many people are involved in the communist revolution, those three things seem to be the path towards modernity, the path towards a better life. And the Communist Party was united by a front of the workers, they had peasants, and they had what we might call the petite bourgeoisie, so more humble middle class individuals, as opposed to the more nationalist bourgeoisie. So what are Mao's moves? What does Mao do in the 1950s and 1960s? For starters, he adopts a Soviet model of development. He gets the USSR to send assistance. They push for equal rights of women. They push for land reform. So they want to eliminate the landlord class. And this, of course, occurs quite violently throughout the 1950s and 60s. They have goals of creating a heavy industry like the USSR, with huge state-owned enterprises pushing the Chinese nation towards modernity. And they have a Congress, the first National People's Congress, established in 1954. This turns into essentially just a rubber stamp for Mao's regime, but this is the idea. He's a good revolutionary, so he wants to expand communism in Asia. We've covered this topic a little bit in the past, so he won't go in the weeds here, but he's encouraging the expansion of communism into Japan, into the Indochina Peninsula, into Korea, into Vietnam, and so forth. This results in the Korean War, right? Which lasts from 1950 to 1953. The Americans, fighting under the banner of the United Nations, had sent soldiers to push back against a communist invasion of South Korea into the capital city of Seoul. And in response to successfully pushing back the Korean communists, the Chinese send in something like 1 million soldiers dressed up as Koreans, eventually pushing back the United States and other international soldiers to the 38th parallel. A peace agreement is signed, creating North and South Korea. And that environment remains to this day. Fascinatingly, Montreat connection, Ruth Bell Graham, the daughter of L. Nelson Bell, whom our library is named after, went to school in Pyongyang as a young daughter of a missionary family. Pyongyang was once a center of Christian thinking in Korea. Mao. What else is Mao doing? Back home, he is attempting to reform society. In 1956, he really pulls a very dirty trick. He announces a movement with the slogan, "Let 100 flowers bloom." This is known as the 100 Flowers campaign. Students were encouraged to voice students and intellectuals were encouraged to voice their feelings about the less nice aspects of the regime, which many did, including our heroine Lin Zhao, whom we'll talk about in just a few moments. Unfortunately for these intellectuals and students, this turned out to be a ploy, according to Mao, to, quote, enforce the snakes out of their lairs. All who had dared to voice protest were labeled rightists. So this 100 Flowers campaign leads into an anti-rightist campaign where hundreds of thousands were sent off into exile for years of, quote, redemption through labor. Often they were sent to the frozen north. Many of them had to go through these kind of intense psychological near torture moments where they had to examine what went wrong in their thought patterns and where they failed to show true devotion to Maoism. On the economic side of things, initial reforms to change China along the Soviet model proved to be ineffective at the time. So there is a sea change. There's a so-called Great Leap Forward in 1956 to 1962, where Mao is attempting to create his own version of modernity that's more Chinese than Soviet. It's more based on the peasant class. So millions of people are moved around in a pattern very similar to collectivization that occurred in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And in this process, there's this belief that the people themselves can create steel, right? Steel is needed to create modernity, to create skyscrapers and so forth, and modern factories. So millions of Chinese peasants are pressured to create steel in their backyard, which, as it turns out, is impossible. And there was so much pressure to create steel that people would take their silverware and throw it into these backyard kilns, producing, unfortunately, essentially garbage. So this went very poorly, and people begin to starve. Here in the slide, you can see some of these kilns. During the Great Leap, other techniques were to kill the mosquitoes. So people are going out there attempting to trap mosquitoes. This is something that our heroine Lin Zhao herself does as well. There's a moment where they attempt to turn the stoplights from red for stop to red for go. They issue a memo. They change all the stoplights, and the next day there's tens of thousands of car accidents. There's a campaign to kill all the sparrows, which are harming the crops. So the sparrows are killed. There's great competitions all across China to kill the sparrows. Local children are made turned into folk heroes. But when the sparrows are killed, the locusts move in, destroy the crops, and starvation begins to seep into the countryside, especially into the interior of the country. It's estimated that between 30 and 36 million individuals. As you can see on this graph, the birth rate in China plummets precipitously, and the death rate climbs drastically in the Great Leap Forward. This is not a good thing for Mao. In the early 1960s, Mao is actually essentially sidelined. He's in semi-seclusion. But in the early 60s, he hatches a plan to purify the party. Having grown increasingly uneasy about what he believed was the creeping capitalist and anti-socialist tendency in the country. He comes up with these material incentives that had been, he comes up with this plan to restore the peasants and the youth to the center of the party. Essentially, he's launching a counter-revolution. So to arrest the so-called capitalist trend, Mao puts out a little red book of his sayings, which people start memorizing, almost like Bible verses that we memorize in Sunday school here in the United States. And he launches what's called the Cultural Revolution. The primary emphasis was restoring ideological purity, reinfusing revolutionary fervor into the party and government bureaucracies, and intensifying class struggle. Now, there's some opposition, mainly from moderates Liu Zhaqi and Deng Xiaoping, but for the most part, Mao is successful in this cultural revolution. His goal here is to destroy the four olds: old ideology, old thoughts, old habits, and old customs. Those who opposed Mao were publicly punished. In this huge re-education campaign, it's a disaster for the economy. Farm production fell, factory workers stopped, schools closed. As a result, there is essentially no economy. It was an enormous failure, and Mao ended it he sort of put the brakes on it in 1969, but it really wouldn't end until he passed away in 1976. In this process, many suffered and died, between 500,000 and 2 million. In many ways, an entire generation lost much of its schooling. Intellectuals suffered heavily. There's a huge loss of cultural heritage. And this brings to mind Milovan Dildosh. He wrote The New Class in 1957. This communist who was beginning to see issues pointed out in the system, pointed out the central paradox of communist ideology. Once a party had consolidated its power base, it would display the same exploitative characteristics as the capital system it had claimed to be dismantling. This communist politician from Yugoslavia, great political theorist and author, added that it was the foot soldiers who tended to suffer the most. Revolutionaries, he said, who accepted the ideas and slogans of the revolution are usually liquidated. Normal life, he said, cannot sustain revolutionary attitudes for long. And it would have been wonderful if Lin Zhao could have learned from this political theorist as she embarked on a career in communism. So here, let's turn to the extraordinary life and death of the martyr Lin Zhao. Now, she's quite well known inside China. Outside China, she is practically unknown, hence the title of Lian Ji's book, The Untold Story of Lin Zhao. Now, how did she become known? One big thing happened in 2004. In 2004, a long letter she wrote from prison, from her prison cells, to the People's Daily. The People's Daily was the Chinese Party's mouthpiece. So this 137-page letter was digitized, and it really set a Promethean fire to sort of modern contemporary dissent. In this letter, she wrote, "Mao must be the first to bear responsibility for the tragedy of her land swarming with famished refugees and the corpses of the starved filling up valleys." Writing this to criticize the Great Leap Forward. And what's fascinating about people began to realize that in the 1960s, she was one of the few who held out resistance when many others were either silenced through death or prison after the anti-rightist campaign. And people became fascinated because she wrote these letters with her own blood. She would prick her fingers with anything she could find, and she wrote these blood letters in prison when the ink was taken away from her. She is also remembered for the 5-cent bullet fee her family was forced to pay, the price of the bullet that was used to assassinate her or to murder her in 1968 when she was sentenced to death. So, what gave her the moral verve or hope to oppose Mao's state orthodoxy? Let's take a look at the life of Lin Zhao. So she was born in 1932 into a prominent family in southeast China, just outside of Shanghai. Father's an academic. Her mother is an elected congressperson, essentially, in Chiang Kai-shek's republic. So a very prominent family. And they sent her to the Laura Haygood Normal School, a school that was founded by the Southern Methodist missionary efforts. So she's provided a Christian education. She learns what it means to be a modern Christian woman. She learns what it means to practice modern Christian womanhood. There she receives a liberal education, and this Christian education has an influence. Around the age of 16, she becomes a convert. Reading from page 17 of the book, this school, quote, cultivated cosmopolitan social mores in its students. Emancipation was on everyone's lips and took tangible form in unbound feet and bobbed hair. Many students also championed coeducation, as well as inheritance and divorce rights for women. So, like many missionary schools in Asia and in Africa and the developing world, these were sort of breeding places for democratic activists and activists for a new and modern world. But the changes were only so much. These were slow and gradual changes that the school pushed for. So almost immediately after she becomes a young Christian convert, she converts to communism. This is her second conversion. And on Thursday, we'll talk about why this seemed to be such a natural conversion and why even some Christian missionaries were fans of communism. And this conversion had considerable risks. For starters, her family is doing very well in the prominent Republican regime. She would have access to leadership opportunities through her family. And you can imagine what the educators at Laura Haygood School thought of her communist trajectory. But it should be said this was very much a trend in that progressive Christian school. So she converts to communism. She skips going to college at the great ire of her parents, and she joins a party-run journalism school. She attends the Yangzhou Journalism Vocational School. And during this period, she loses her party membership, in part because she's not willing to reject or vilify her family in sufficient manner. Nonetheless, she carries on, and she joins the Rural Work Corps, where she helps in land reform efforts, essentially a large project to persecute individuals who owned land and homes, often very quite violently, and she's writing propaganda for this effort. She's a very zealous young communist. Eventually, she heads back to the university. She attends Peking University, which is the leading university in China, the Harvard of China. And she's attending the school in the late 50s, in this period in which Mao was pushing this 100 Flowers campaign, encouraging intellectuals, professors, and students to speak out publicly in what turned out to be a great ruse. In this large process, she appears to come back to her faith. She attends church services. She writes poems. She writes 2 long poems for an underground journal. This eventually gets her punished and kicked out of school. She also falls in love with a young gentleman seen here on the slide called Gong Shui, who was brutally cut off from her when he was banished to work on a construction battalion 7 days' journey away, an exile that would last for 20 years. The 2 happy young lovers would never see each other again. Now, many of these professors wanted to protest what was happening here. So they produce, in 1960, I believe, a document called, an underground newspaper called A Spark of Fire, a tremendous journal title. Lin was hesitant. She was not sure that this would really be helpful about this, but she's growing more and more illusioned with communism, and sort of she becomes an anti-communist actor during this period. Her writing in this, which we'll examine on Thursday, was titled A Day in Prometheus's Passion. It mocked Mao by painting him as a villainous Zeus. So, not surprisingly, those who participated in the publication of A Spark of Fire were rounded up, and she herself is sent to prison. Now, she'd spend the next 8 years in prison. She'd have a few furloughs for health reasons. She was constantly battling pneumonia. But in prison, she refuses to break. They're encouraged to go through internal reform processes. Instead, she writes daily protest poems with ink, and when ink was taken away from her, she would poke her finger and write them in blood. She's sentenced ultimately to 20 years in prison. And in her prison years, she denounces the entire system. And the author of Blood Letters, Lian Ji, makes the claim that what gave her the verve, the hope, was a Christian faith. This gave her the backbone to protest. Eventually, in 1967, she is sentenced to death for being, quote, truly a diehard, unrepentant counter-revolutionary. Before being sentenced to death, she'd write home to her mother, who had also converted to Christianity, "Don't grieve for me, dear mama. A raging fire refines the true gold. After all, I am in the hands of the Heavenly Father. No, not in the hands of those demons." Upon her death, certainly a great tragedy for her family. When she was sentenced to prison, her father committed suicide in 1960. Her mother would die a broken woman a few years later. Some of her siblings would reject her. But this was certainly a very difficult prison experience. She would often spend, that was a cough, it should be known, dear listener, due to me working in the shed. Let's hope it was just that, some sawdust. Okay, so she was often forced to wear both hands behind her back, handcuffed. This lasted an entire 6 months. At other times, she was forced to wear a monkey cap over her face, as you can see in this image. And what happens is that in 1981, in a reformist period in China, her letters were released to her family, surviving members of her family, who began to release them in public. And in 2004, when her 137-page diatribe against the Communist Party was released, she became a folk hero to human rights activists and dissidents in modern China. On the slide, you can see the Chinese activist Zhu Zhengji, who was imprisoned after seeking to visit her grave. In fact, here you can see images from 2008. These pictures are from the author Lian Zhi, where the Chinese military was brought in to make sure that devotees could not pay homage to the martyr Lin Zhao. Indeed, it's possible that her grave might have been moved altogether due to a, quote, fire safety issue at that particular cemetery. But nonetheless, her story is now out in the public, an inspiration for many current Chinese reformists. All right. So I'm looking forward to our discussion about the extraordinary life of Lin Zhao. But let's sort of conclude, and I'll move relatively quickly here as we survey the last 40, 50 years of Chinese history. So Mao's Cultural Revolution was, in many ways, a large failure. And in the midst of the struggle, they're looking for an exit path. So in 1971, one exit path for the Chinese is to improve relations with the United States. The United States is hoping to push China and the Soviet Union apart. Indeed, those two nations, those two communist brothers, had grown further apart as they each had a different idea of how to best lead communism. The Chinese wanted a more thorough revolutionary communism that was focused on the peasants. The Chinese were more focused on production. But the Chinese sent signals to, of all people, individuals, the United States ping pong team. In a tournament in Japan in 1971, they say, hey, we want to talk to your government. So this is famously remembered in Forrest Gump, as you can see here in this image. So communication begins. Eventually, in a huge shock, the United States Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and his counterpart in China organized a meet and greet between President Nixon in 1972, shortly before his fall, and the Chinese Premier Mao Zedong, where they send signals that they'll begin to ease relations between countries, and they establish eventually diplomatic relations. Now, Mao would die in 1976, and after a flurry of activity, a reformer, a moderate communist named Deng Xiaoping, would succeed him. He would return the favor, and he would visit the United States in 1975. He attends a rodeo. He says hi to Jimmy Carter, and he tells Jimmy, hey, listen, why don't you send some of your factories over to China? And we can have these special economic zones where foreign investment is encouraged. So in the 1980s and 1990s to today, thousands of factories begin to move from the United States to China, to these special economic zones. How could they do this? Well, they're essentially pivoting from revolutionary communism to authoritarian capitalist communism. State enterprises had these certain quotas that they had to create, a certain number of light bulbs. And they said, well, listen, after you create these certain number of light bulbs, you can do whatever you want. Eventually, these quotas were lowered, essentially to zero, so that these companies could do whatever they wanted to do. And they created a world with new shipping processes that had been greatly reduced the price of international shipping. So now we have a world of Best Buys and Targets and Walmarts and Best Buys. We have the dollar spot, all created due to this authoritarian capitalism, which China, as it turns out, was incredibly gifted at. Limits to reform. One of these limits to reform occurred in 1989. In Beijing, crowds gathered to see a new freedom statue. When officials ordered the crowd to leave, they refused, many of them students from universities. Pro-democracy supporters were arrested, others were killed. Here in this incredibly iconic image, you can see the so-called tank man stopping the 4 Chinese tanks from persecuting young student dissidents. Now, if you attend China today, this very famous day, moment in history, has been excised from the history books. Many young Chinese individuals do not know that this ever occurred. Today, this authoritarian capitalism moves forward with Xi Jinping. There's a spelling error in this slide, where he continues to press for authoritarian capitalism, communism with a warm smile, a nice and modern face. Now, what about Christianity in China? What about the faith of Lin Zhao? What's happening with Christianity in China? Christianity in China is booming. There are between 100 and possibly 200 million Christians in China, which will very soon make China the world's most populous Christian nation. In fact, on the low end of things, if you want to count 100 million Christians in China, that's more than the 88 million strong membership of the ruling Communist Party, which a young Lin Zhao had sought so hard to be a part of. The Communist Party moves back and forth between attempting to control Christianity, trying to give it some space to thrive, but there are limits to this. In 2014, there was a Christian church in Wenzhou that built a steeple too high. It's one thing to be a thriving Christian community. It's one thing to have a church, a very public church space for all to see a thriving Christianity. This church and others like it were destroyed in the last few years. But I'm quite hopeful. I think the story of Lin Zhao will only grow in China and the rest of the world. Stories of other Christian dissidents in China continue to make waves. The last few years, we've seen pro-democracy activism in Hong Kong, which has been led by Christians. And perhaps by the year 2050, China will be the most Christian nation in the world, whether it remains communist or not. All right. That's enough for today. Thank you for joining me on this journey of looking at China in the 20th century. Till next time.